Hey guys, and welcome to another Quick Pi video. In this video, we're going to compare the new Rock64 with the Raspberry Pi 3. The Rock64 is the newest single-board computer from the Pine A64 company. The Raspberry Pi 3 is the most well-established single-board computer on the market. Let's see how these two compare and what their differences are as well. So here's a closer look at the Rock64, the newest board from the Pine 64 Corporation. This corporation first made the Pine A64, which they launched on Kickstarter to success and shipped to all backers. If you've been a subscriber of the channel, you might have seen my video comparison of the Pine A64 to the Raspberry Pi 3. The Rock64 pretty much built on all the caveats of the Pine A64 and as well as gives many more options that might be useful to consumers. So let's take a closer look at the hardware that powers it. So at the center of the board, you can see the Rockchip RK3328 system on chip. This is the main processor of the board. On the left side, you can see the RAM. On the right side of the Rockchip RK3328, you can see a Realtek chip that manages the Gigabit Ethernet port. And on the top right corner of the Rockchip RK3328, you can see the USB controller. So next, let's move on to the I/O and as well as the other options in this board. So here's the front of the board. So on the left side, you have your Gigabit Ethernet port with the two status LEDs. And then on the middle, you have your two USB 2.0 ports. And then on the right side, you have your one USB 3.0 port. In my opinion, the USB 3.0 ports is one of the most useful parts of this single board computer. A lot of people tend to use their single board computers as some kind of server or media device. Having such a USB 3.0 port allows for more bandwidth and thus allows for much more complex applications. The USB 2.0 ports on most of the other single board computers tend to be bandwidth limited, and having such a USB 3.0 port allows for more server options and as well as settings that could be configured to make advantage of this extra bandwidth. So here on the left side of the board, you can see your DC 5V 3A input. So this is a major letdown of this board. The board cannot be powered by a micro USB port. You need a dedicated DC 5V 3A adapter, which Rock64 sells. Right next to this DC port is the HDMI port, which is capable of 4K 60 frames per second. Right next to that, you have a 3.5mm composite jack, which could be used for audio and video. So now we're on the back side of the board. So from left to right, there's two LEDs which show the startup LED and as well as a power LED. There's two buttons, one of them's for power and one of them's to reset the board. In the center of the board, you can see the eMMC module connector, and right below that at the bottom of the board, you can see the SD card slot, and then right next to the eMMC module, you can see the IR transceiver, and right next to that, you can see the small LED, which indicates if your 5V 3A power supply is good enough to run the board. So here at the last side of the board, you can see the many GPIO pins that are available for the Rock64. So the first GPIO header is the 40-pin Pi2-3 GPIO header. So you have the 40 pin set up in the same way they're on the Raspberry Pi 2 and Raspberry Pi 3. Then right next to that, you have the eMMC jumper. So if you're using an eMMC module with your Rock64, you just want to put a jumper here, which forces the Rock chip RK3328 to read from the eMMC module, and right next to that you have a supplementary 22-pin connector with more GPIO pins if the 40 on the main header weren't enough. So now let's take a look at the Raspberry Pi 3. Okay, so this is the Raspberry Pi 3, the latest iteration from the Raspberry Pi Foundation in the Raspberry Pi series. This board is most probably one of the most popular and most probably the most successful single board computer on this market. It retails for $35 and is available almost around the world. So let's take a look at the main hardware that powers the Raspberry Pi 3. So on the top, just like the Asus Tinkerboard, this has its own 40-pin GPIO layout. This has almost become an industry standard on the single board computer market. And then on the right side, you have your 4 USB 2.0 ports and your 100 megabits per second Ethernet port. These are all controlled through the SMSC chipset that you can see right on the left side. Then on the bottom of your board, you have your micro USB for power, your HDMI port, only capable of up to 1080p, your camera connector, and then as well as your 3.5mm jack that can be used for audio and video or just for audio and microphone. And then on your left side, you have your display connector and as well as the ceramic Wi-Fi antenna. So the center of the board is the main heart of this board. you have your Broadcom BCM2837 processor, which is almost proprietary to this board. Okay, so let's take a look at the in-depth detailed technical specifications of both of these boards. So for the Raspberry Pi 3, it has a 1.2 GHz BCM2387 ARM Cortex-A53 quad-core 64-bit processor manufactured by Broadcom. The Rock64 has a 1.8 GHz RK3328, and just like the Raspberry Pi, it has an ARM Cortex-A53 quad-core 64-bit processor manufactured by the Rockchip Corporation. So the Rock64 has a bit of an advantage here since it's overclocked by about 600 MHz. In terms of GPU power, the Raspberry Pi 3 has a Broadcom Video Core 4, and the Rock64 has an ARM Mali 450 MP2. The RAM on the Raspberry Pi 3 is lackluster. It only has a gigabyte of 900 MHz LPDDR2. On the Rock64, you can either get 1 GB, 2 GB, or 4 GB of 1600 MHz LPDDR3. In terms of video output on the Raspberry Pi 3, you're limited to HDMI composite and up to a resolution of 1080p at 60 Hz. On the Rock64, you can only do video output on the HDMI by default, but you can use up to 4K Ultra HD resolution with HDR and at 60 Hz. In terms of connectivity, you have Ethernet, Wi-Fi, and Bluetooth on the Raspberry Pi 3. On the Rock64, you're only limited to Ethernet. In terms of storage, the Raspberry Pi 3 is allowed to use the microSD card slot, and it has a default of 64 GB. And for the Rock64, you also have a microSD card slot with a 64 GB max, but you can also use the eMMC slot as the default boot option or as a secondary storage option. In terms of USB ports, the Raspberry Pi 3 has 4 USB 2.0 ports. The Rock64 only has 2 USB 2.0 ports, but it also has 1 USB 3.0 port, which is useful for high bandwidth applications. In terms of GPIO pins, the Raspberry Pi 3 only has 40 GPIO pins. The Pine64 Rock64 has 66 GPIO pins, 40 of which are in the Raspberry Pi 2 setup. So if you have any kind of Raspberry Pi accessories that use the GPIO pins, they might be backwards compatible with the Rock64. In terms of the Ethernet port, the Raspberry Pi 3 only has up to 100 megabits per second. On the Rock64, you can do up to 1 gigabit per second. In terms of power input, the Raspberry Pi uses the regular micro USB and is recommended to have 5 volts 2.1 amps. On the Rock64, you have your DC barrel jack, which is a 3.5 millimeter one, and it has to have a power output of 5 volts 3 amps. So this is a bit proprietary and can cause you to buy a secondary power adapter, which you might have to buy directly through the Pine64 company. In terms of dimensions, both boards have the same dimensions, and in terms of pricing, the Raspberry Pi 3 has a dead price of $35 MSRP, and the Rock64 has an MSRP that ranges from $24.95 all the way to $44.95, depending on the RAM option you choose. So here are the full benchmarks for both of these boards. So on the Raspberry Pi 3, I used Ubuntu Mate 64-bit, which is the 16.04.2 long-term support version, and then for the Rock64, I used the Debian Jessie Minimal Image 64-bit version as well, which is 0.4.16-83. I downloaded both from the official websites. So I ran the sysbench test on both boards to test the processors. In terms of what the operating system was saved on, I used the SD card, same SD card for both boards, so that the results would not be very different at all. So the sysbench 1000 single core score, it took 6.1474 seconds on the Raspberry Pi 3, and then on the Rock64, it only took 0.6436 seconds, which is almost 10x faster than the Raspberry Pi 3. So I actually ran these benchmarks multiple times on both boards to make sure that I was not getting the wrong data. And what you're seeing is an average is about 10 tests. So then on the Sysbench 1000 dual core, I got 3.1137 seconds on the Raspberry Pi 3. And once again, almost a 1 to 10x difference on the Rock64, just 0.3631 seconds. And then on quad core, you see the same thing happening. So these are actually very short workloads on the Raspberry Pi 3 and Rock64. If you're doing long-term computing, it's most likely more than 6.14 seconds of peak processing. And then on the Sysbench 5000 single core, I got 59 seconds on the Raspberry Pi 3. And then on the Rock64, it was just 4.74 seconds. On the dual core, 29 seconds on the Raspberry Pi 3, 2.3 seconds on the Rock64. And then on the Sysbench 5000 quad core, 14.86 seconds on the Raspberry Pi 3, and just 1.23 seconds on the Rock64. From these numbers, you can see that the Rock64's RK3387 processor is very, very powerful. I believe this is not just the 600 megahertz improvement, but the processor optimization overall itself. Currently, the Ubuntu Mate that I used for the Raspberry Pi 3 had a GUI and could have had background services that are running, but definitely you can see that the Rock64, even though it's running a Debian Jessie minimal image, it's just blowing it through the water. So if it was just a 600 megahertz difference that was causing this, it would be about a 30 to 40% increase. But in the times here, you're going from 6 seconds on the Raspberry Pi to 0.6 seconds on the Rock64, which shows the true computing power of the Rock64. This is truly a super powerful board, and from the benchmarks you can see it's just blowing the Raspberry Pi 3 out of the water in terms of computing. So now let's take a look at the pricing for the Rock64. So Rock64 starts at $24 and goes all the way to $44.95. The $24.95 is for the base 1GB RAM model, and the $44.95 is the high-end 4GB RAM model. So if you're a beginner not really looking to do anything with the GUI, I think the 1GB model should be fine. If you're looking to run media centers, multiple applications, stuff like that, you should go for the really high-end $44 model. If you're not sure what you're going to do, I suggest going for the mid-level model, which is $34.95. You also need the proprietary 5-volt 3-amp DC barrel power supply, which is $6.99. And also, rather than an SD card, I suggest going for the eMMC module because it'll be a bit faster than the micro SD card. So that's about $14. So in total, you're looking to spend anywhere from $45.89 to $65.89 depending on what you need, and this does not include shipping. All these prices are directly from the Pine64 website, where the Rock64 is only sold right now. It might be available in Amazon and other retailers soon, but for now, it's only on the Pine64.org website. Now, this is the pricing for the Raspberry Pi 3. So these are all prices pulled from the US Amazon website on August 15th, 2017. So the Raspberry Pi 3 is $35.70. That's the only model there is. So this is the recommended power supply for the Raspberry Pi. That's $9.99. If you do have the charger at home, an iPad brick usually works. That could save you the $9.99. And then for the SD card, this is the most recommended SD card for the Raspberry Pi 3. It's a Samsung Ultra Class 10 micro SD card, 16 gigs, just like the 16 gigs eMMC that I selected for the Rock64, which comes in at $10.04. And in total, you should be looking to spend about $55.73 US dollars to get started with the Raspberry Pi 3. And since this is above the $35 limit for shipping, you should also be getting free shipping if you don't have Prime. So that's including all US prices. So if you are in another country, the pricing might be a bit different, and in the exchange rates might affect your currency. But other than that, the Rock64 is cheaper to begin with, but a mid-level model in both boards should be the same price. And if you're looking for the full 4 gigs of RAM, I suggest going for the Rock64, and that's just about $10 more than the Pi 3. So now time for the final conclusions on the boards. The Rock64 is a great board for what it is. The processing power clearly blows the Raspberry Pi out of the water, and it also has much more capabilities. If you're looking for just a general server or some kind of integrated solution like a media center or something like that, I think the Rock64 is a much better option than the Raspberry Pi 3. If you're planning to get hands-on, use the GPIO pins and all that, and you're a complete beginner, I completely suggest the Raspberry Pi 3. The Rock64 might have more GPIO pins and all, but the Raspberry Pi 3 has the pre-written libraries and as well as the community forums that the Rock64 clearly does not have yet. The Raspberry Pi 3 clearly is meant for beginners who have never had any exposure to single-board computers, and there's step-by-step videos on the Raspberry Pi made by millions of people online. The Rock64 is really designed not for beginners, but for enthusiasts and amateurs who have already had experience with single board computers and Linux and are willing to get their hands dirty in trying to get this to work. it might be just easy to run Kodi or some kind of other media software or installing simple Debian and running server software. But if you're planning to use the GPIOs, I2C buses, and everything like that, the Raspberry Pi 3 already has so many tutorials, pre-made GitHub code libraries for any language you can think of, and stuff like that, that the Rock64 just does not have yet. It'll take a few years for the Rock64 to really build the resources, and that is only if it really builds a support community. So if you're a beginner, I suggest going with the Raspberry Pi 3. If you're an amateur, already have experience with single board computers, and you're willing to get your hands dirty and willing to do the work, I definitely suggest going for the Rock64. It's definitely way more powerful and can do a lot more tasks that are power hungry that the Raspberry Pi 3 might not be able to do. The Rock64 also is $10 cheaper, but the need for the DC 5V 3A power adapter might send its price up a little higher. The Raspberry Pi 3, while it's $35, has the integrated Wi-Fi, uses the regular micro USB, and can run with 2.1 amps, which many people have and come with many people's phones. The Rock64 ultimately is a more advanced board for the more advanced user, while the Raspberry Pi 3 is designed to be easy and just work for everyone. Guys, thanks for watching. Please be sure to subscribe. Please leave in the comments below if you would like me to do any other Showdown videos, and I'll be more than happy to do them. And guys, once again, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.